This is Monica Perez. Welcome to our third and final installment of our reading and discussion of The Law by Frédéric Bastiat. And I wanted to tell you that after this, I'm super excited because to wrap this up next week, I normally do this on Tuesdays. I do it live on Tuesdays on the video streaming. We're usually around 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, and then it's on my podcast feeds Saturday morning for Saturday Story Time. But next Tuesday, instead of doing a book reading, we're going to talk to Jonathan Newman. He's a professor. He's associated with the Mises Institute, and it's going to be a very interesting education on the timeless lessons of Bastiat and why we need to return to them and remind ourselves of them now more than ever. So I'm super excited about that. That's going to be a good one. And then the book I'm going to do after this, because there's all this UFO stuff going on, is, of course, my favorite conspiracy researcher, Jim Keith, Saucers of the Illuminati. So stay tuned for that. But that'll be after we wrap this up with Jonathan Newman. So I'm excited about that. But let's get back to our reading. This is The Law by Bastiat. And we had finished with a little quote from Rousseau. And he's basically ticking off some of the philosophers, political philosophers, whatever. And he includes long passages from their works, and they get a little, not everybody is the greatest writer, so they get a teeny bit tedious. So I'm going to do my best to read them so that they're easy to listen to and understand. And then he just, I think he feels like they speak for themselves, and he puts a little bit of commentary here and there. So we are up to Raynal, Raynal, Raynal. And this is a quote from Raynal. The climate, that is, the air and the soil, is the first element for the legislator. His resources prescribe to him his duties. First, he must consult his local position. A population dwelling upon maritime shores must have laws fitted for navigation. If the colony is located in an inland region, a legislator must provide for the nature of the soil and for its degree of fertility. I don't want to, this is going to be a long one, so I don't want to interject too much, but I want to comment on this. I took a class in water law and when I was in law school, and it was really interesting because like riparian, right? Stuff like that. Dry areas have totally different water laws than wet areas. But the way I have thought about it is it's more like a common law thing. It's more of a tradition. It's more of, so the fundamental question in my mind, like political question, is the origin of property rights. So if you're mixing your soil and your toil and growing potatoes on land that nobody's occupying, that land is yours. With water, it's different because it flows. It's not as easy to, people just say, well, you can just build a dam and it's yours. But is that really, that's the subtlety about law versus just strict math. Is that really justice? And that's why I love the common law system, is that over hundreds and thousands of years, the fundamental questions of property rights emerge on a case-by-case basis, and eventually almost everything has a precedent. And upon those precedents, other precedents are built. And when some of them don't hold up under that new pressure, they get changed. But it really has to do with what's real. And so I respect this paragraph, but I wouldn't attribute it to the legislator. I would attribute it to the organic, the society is self-ordering, to put it in Hayek's terms. Okay, let's continue with Raynal. It is more especially in the distribution of property that the wisdom of legislation will appear. As a general rule, and in every country, when a new colony is founded, land should be given to each man sufficient for the support of his family. I'm already like, no, it's not, the legislator doesn't own the land. There are organic ways for this to happen. And if you're addressing the how to deal with colonizing, maybe you should think about real fundamental property rights and if you even have a right to be there. In an uncultivated island, which you are colonizing with children, it will only be needful to let the germs of truth expand in the developments of reason. But when you establish old people in a new country, the skill consists in only allowing it those injurious opinions and customs which it is impossible to cure and correct. If you wish to prevent them from being perpetuated, you will act upon the rising generation by a general and public education of the children. A prince or legislator ought never to found a colony without previously sending wise men there to instruct the youth. In a new colony, every facility is open to the precautions of the legislator who desires to purify the tone and the manners of the people. If he has genius and virtue, the lands and the men that are at his disposal will inspire his soul with a plan of society that a writer can only vaguely trace, and in a way that would be subject to the instability of all hypotheses, which are varied and complicated by an infinity of circumstances too difficult to foresee and to combine. Bastiat comments, one would think it was a professor of agriculture who was saying to his pupils, and then he goes on, Raynal, quoting Raynal, the climate is the only rule for the agriculturist. His resources dictate to him his duties. The first thing he has to consider is his local position. If he is on a clayey soil, he must do so and so. If he has to contend with sand, this is the way in which he must set about it. Every facility is open to the agriculturalist who wishes to clear and improve his soil. If he only has the skill, the manure which he has at his disposal will suggest to him a plan of operation, which a professor can only vaguely trace, and in a way that would be subject to the uncertainty of all hypotheses, which vary and are complicated by an infinity of circumstances too difficult to foresee and to combine. But oh, this is Bastiat. Sublime writers, deign to remember sometimes that this clay, this sand, this manure of which you are disposing in so arbitrary a manner are men, your equals, intelligent and free beings like yourselves, who have received from God, as you have, the faculty of seeing, of foreseeing, of thinking, and of judging for themselves. So that's that for Raynal. Then he goes on to Mabley. He is supposing, so this is a parenthetical by Bastiat regarding this quote that follows with Mabley. He is supposing the laws to be worn out by time and by the neglect of security, and continues thus. Under these circumstances, we must be convinced that the bonds of government are slack. Give them a new tension. It is the reader who is addressed, and the evil would be remedied. Think less of punishing the faults than of encouraging the virtues that you want. By this method, you will bestow upon your republic the vigor of youth. Through ignorance of this, a free people has lost its liberty. But if the evil has made so much way that the ordinary magistrates are unable to remedy it effectually, have recourse to an extraordinary magistracy whose time should be short and its power considerable. The imagination of the citizens requires to be impressed. Bastiat says, in this style, he goes on through 20 volumes. There was a time when, under the influence of teaching like this, which is the foundation of classical education, everyone was for placing himself beyond and above mankind, for the sake of arranging, organizing, and instituting it in his own way. I must say, this is me, that I totally agree. Like I grew up, my dad was a trucker. I was the youngest of 9. I dropped out of high school. If anyone should be disenfranchised by an elitist mentality, it would be someone like me. And I don't necessarily believe in voting. I mean, disenfranchised more broadly. But the more like I see how the majority, the demos, falls for this cult of personality, not just Trump, but other things like that too. I mean, I had so much hope with Ron Paul because they loved him for the truth that resonated with them, as they inherited it, like I did. And but now I'm like, maybe these guys who believed in an elite or whatever weren't so far off. But then you have that book, which I haven't read yet. I think it's a Rothbard book about the natural elite, which again also could be distorted and exploited. But anyway, but yes, we'd be lost if we weren't respected as equal humans. Okay, next is Condillac. Take upon yourself, my lord. This is the quote by Condillac, which is Condillac. Take upon yourself, my lord, the character of Lycurgus or of Solon. Before you finish reading this essay, amuse yourself with giving laws to some wild people in America or in Africa. Establish these roving men in fixed dwellings. Teach them to keep flocks. Endeavor to develop the social qualities that nature has implanted in them. Make them begin to practice the duties of humanity. Cause the pleasures of the passions to become distasteful to them by punishments. And you will see these barbarians and every plan of your legislation lose a vice and gain a virtue. All these people have had laws, but few among them have been happy. What the fuck does this guy know? Why is this? Because legislators have almost always been ignorant of the object of society, which is to unite families by a common interest. Impartiality in law consists in two things. Okay, that was just a crazy assumption to make. I would personally say that if there is any legitimacy to government, it is for the sole purpose of keeping people off me and my stuff. Don't touch me and my stuff. Thank you for the help. Okay, impartiality in law consists in two things: in establishing equality in the fortunes and in the dignity of the citizens. In proportion to the degree of equality established by the laws, the dearer will they become to every citizen. How can avarice, ambition, dissipation, idleness, sloth, envy, hatred, or jealousy agitate men who are equal in fortune and dignity, and to whom the laws leave no hope of disturbing their equality? Equal in fortune? What has been told you of the Republic of Sparta ought to enlighten you on this question. No other state has had laws more in accordance with the order of nature or of equality. Here's Bastiat. It is not to be wondered at that the 17th and 18th centuries should have looked upon the human race as inert matter, ready to receive everything, form, figure, impulse, movement, and life from a great prince or a great legislator or a great genius. These ages were reared in the study of antiquity, and antiquity presents everywhere, in Egypt, Persia, Greece, and Rome, the spectacle of a few men molding mankind according to their fancy, and mankind to this end enslaved by force or by imposture. And what does this prove? That because men and society are improvable, error, ignorance, despotism, slavery, and superstition must be more prevalent in early times. The mistake of the writers quoted above is not that they have asserted this fact, but that they have proposed it as a rule for the admiration and imitation of future generations. Their mistake has been with an inconceivable absence of discernment and upon the faith of a puerile conventionalism that they have admitted what is inadmissible, viz., the grandeur, dignity, morality, and well-being of the artificial societies of the ancient world. They have not understood that time produces and spreads enlightenment, and that in proportion to the increase of enlightenment, right ceases to be upheld by force and society regains possession of herself. I sometimes wonder if that's like a major difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's a working theory. I have to finish reading it first. Okay. And in fact, what is the political work that we are endeavoring to promote? It is no other than the instinctive effort of every people towards liberty. And what is liberty? Whose name can make every heart beat and which can agitate the world? But the union of all liberties, the liberty of conscience, of education, of association. That's the most important one. Living or working with somebody you detest is the worst form of torture, in my opinion. Of the press, of movement, of labor, and of exchange. In other words, the free exercise for all of all the inoffensive faculties. And again, in other words, the destruction of all despotisms, even of legal despotism, and the reduction of law to its only rational sphere, which is to regulate the individual right of legitimate defense or to repress injustice. Yes, Regulate the individual right of legitimate defense. That's it. I would say augment it, but perhaps I'm wrong on that. This tendency of the human race, it must be admitted, is greatly thwarted, particularly in our country, by the fatal disposition resulting from classical teaching and common to all politicians of placing themselves beyond mankind to arrange, organize, and regulate it according to their fancy. For whilst society is struggling to realize liberty, the great men who placed themselves at its head, imbued with the principles of the 17th and 18th centuries, think only of subjecting it to the philanthropic despotism of their social inventions and making it bear with docility, according to the expression of Rousseau, the yoke of public felicity as pictured in their own imaginations. Man, these guys must have had like there's like a lot of ideas. I was going to say higher standards for their writing. Bigger words contain a lot more ideas and take longer to absorb, in my opinion. So hopefully you can absorb this or just listen to it twice. This was particularly the case in 1789. No sooner was the old system destroyed than society was to be submitted to other artificial arrangements, always with the same starting point: the omnipotence of the law. Okay, so he's running through a few. Yes, so I want to read that again because I think it's so important of Bastiat. He says, no sooner was the old system destroyed, this is 1789, then society was to be submitted to other artificial arrangements, always with the same starting point: the omnipotence of the law. And he's, quote, just running through a few. Saint Just, the legislator commands the future. It is for him to will for the good of mankind. It is for him to make men what he wishes them to be. Robespierre, the function of government is to direct the physical and moral powers of the nation towards the object of its institution. Biot of Varennes, a people who are to be restored to liberty must be formed anew. Ancient prejudices must be destroyed, antiquated customs changed, depraved affections corrected, inveterate vices eradicated. For this, a strong force and a vehement impulse will be necessary. Citizens, the inflexible austerity of Lycurgus created the firm basis of the Spartan Republic. The feeble and trusting disposition of Solon plunged Athens into slavery. This parallel contains the whole science of government. Wow. They really like the Spartan style. Lapetier. I would say Lapeltier, but it's Lapetier. Considering the extent of human degradation, I am convinced of the necessity of effecting an entire regeneration of the race, and if I may say so, express myself, of creating a new people. Men, therefore, are nothing but raw material. It is not for them to will their own improvement. They are not capable, this is Bastiat, of course, they are not capable of it, according to St. Just. It is only the legislator who is. Men are merely to be what he wills that they should be. According to Robespierre, who copies Rousseau literally, the legislator is to begin by assigning the aim of the institutions of the nation. After this, the government has only to direct all its physical and moral forces towards this end. All this time, the nation itself is to remain perfectly passive, and Biot Varennes would teach us that it ought to have no prejudices, affections, nor wants, but such as are authorized by the legislator. He even goes so far as to say that the inflexible austerity of a man is the basis of a republic. We have seen that in cases where the evil is so great that the ordinary magistrates are unable to remedy it, Mabley recommends a dictatorship to promote virtue. Quote, have recourse, says he, to an extraordinary magistracy whose time shall be short and his power considerable. The imagination of the people requires to be impressed. This doctrine has not been neglected. Listen to Robespierre. Another quote here. The principle of the Republican government is virtue, and the means to be adopted during its establishment is terror. We want to substitute in our country morality for self-indulgence, probity for honor, principles for customs, duties for decorum. the empire of reason for the tyranny of fashion, contempt of vice for contempt of misfortune, pride for insolence, greatness of soul for vanity, love of glory for love of money, good people for good company, merit for intrigue, genius for wit, truth for glitter, the charm of happiness for the weariness of pleasure, the greatness of man for the littleness of the great, a magnanimous, powerful, happy people for one that is easy, frivolous, degraded. That is to say, we would substitute all the virtues and miracles of a republic for all the vices and absurdities of monarchy. I mean, that just seems to me like, is it pedagogy, whatever, demagoguery? Just trying to convince people to do it. Because I think the French Revolution was a complete bait and switch, as well as the American Revolution and the Russian Revolution, which all within 10 years were replaced, were hijacked. Okay. This is Bastiat. At what a vast height above the rest of mankind does Robespierre place himself here, and observe the arrogance with which he speaks. He is not content with expressing a desire for a great renovation of the human heart. He does not even expect such results from a regular government. No, he intends to effect it himself, and by means of terror. The object of the discourse from which this puerile and laborious mass of antithesis is extracted was to exhibit the principles of morality that ought to direct a revolutionary government. Moreover, when Robespierre asks for a dictatorship, it is not merely for the purpose of repelling a foreign enemy or of putting down factions. It is that he may establish, by means of terror and as a preliminary to the operation of the Constitution, his own principles of morality. He pretends to nothing short of extirpating from the country by means of terror self-interest, honor, customs, decorum, fashion, vanity, the love of money, good company, intrigue, wit, luxury, and misery. It is not until after he, Robespierre, shall have accomplished these miracles, as he rightly calls them, that he will allow the law to regain her empire. Truly, it would be well if these visionaries, who think so much of themselves and so little of mankind, who want to renew everything, would only be content with trying to reform themselves. The task would be arduous enough for them. In general, however, these gentlemen, the reformers, legislators, and politicians, do not desire to exercise an immediate despotism over mankind. No, they are too moderate and too philanthropic for that. They only contend for the despotism, the absolutism, the omnipotence of the law. They aspire only to make the law. To show how universal this strange disposition has been in France, I had need not only to have copied the whole of the works of Mabley, Raynal, Rousseau, Fenelon, and to have made long extracts from Bossuet and Montesquieu, but to have given the entire transactions of the sittings of the convention. I shall do no such thing, however, but merely refer the reader to them. No wonder this idea suited Bonaparte so well. He embraced it with ardor and put it in practice with energy. Playing the part of a chemist, Europe was to him the material for his experiments, but this material reacted against him. More than half undeceived, Bonaparte at St. Helena seemed to admit that there is an initiative in every people, and he became less hostile to liberty. Yet this did not prevent him from giving this lesson to his son in his will, quote, "To govern is to diffuse morality, education, and well-being." Wow. Like diffuse, D-I-F-F-U-S-E, not defuse. Diffuse morality, education, well-being. After all, I mean, that could mean to put it everywhere, but it could also mean to dilute it. Okay. After all this, I hardly need show by fastidious quotations the opinions of a morally Babeuf, Owen, Saint-Simon, and Fourier. I shall confine myself to a few extracts from Louis Blanc's book on the organization of labor. Quote, "In our project, society receives the impulse of power." End quote. In what does the impulse that power gives to society consist? In imposing upon it the project of Mr. Louis Blanc. On the other hand, society is the human race. The human race, then, is to receive its impulse from Mr. Louis Blanc. It is at liberty to do so or not, it will be said. Of course, the human race is at liberty to take advice from anybody, whoever it may be. But this is not the way in which Mr. Louis Blanc understands the thing. He means that his project should be converted into law and consequently forcibly imposed by power. Bastiat nails it. Here's a little quote from Louis Blanc, no doubt. In our project, the state has only to give a legislation to labor, by means of which the industrial movement may and ought to be accomplished in all liberty. It, the state, merely places society on an incline. That is all, that it may descend when once it is placed there by the mere force of things and by the natural course of the established mechanism. End quote. But what is this incline, Bastiat asks? One indicated by Mr. Louis Blanc. Does it not lead to an abyss? No, it leads to happiness. Why then does not society go there of itself? Because it does not know what it wants, and it requires an impulse. What is to give it this impulse? Power. And who is to give the impulse to power? The inventor of the machine, Mr. Louis Blanc. We shall never get out of this circle. Mankind passive and a great man moving it by the intervention of the law. Boy, this is ringing relevant to today. Once on this incline, will society enjoy something like liberty? Without a doubt. And what is liberty? Another quote. Once for all, liberty consists not only in the right granted, but in the power given to man to exercise, to develop his faculties under the empire of justice and under the protection of the law. And this is no vain distinction. There is a deep meaning in it, and its consequences are imponderable. For when once it is admitted that man, to be truly free, must have the power to exercise and develop his faculties, it follows that every member of society has a claim upon it for such education as shall enable his faculties to display themselves, and for the tools of labor, without which human activity can find no scope. Now, by whose intervention is society to give to each of its members the requisite education and the necessary tools of labor, unless by that of the state? End quote. Thus, liberty is power. In what does this power consist? In possessing education and tools of labor. Who is to give education and tools of labor? Society. Who owes them? By whose intervention is society to give tools of labor to those who do not possess them? By the intervention of the state. From whom is the state to obtain them? This, of course, is the question. Any right that places an obligation upon another person is not really a right. You don't have a right to health care. Who has the obligation to provide that health care to you? Okay, it is for the reader to answer this question and to notice whither all this tends. One of the strangest phenomena of our time, and one that will probably be a matter of astonishment to our descendants, is the doctrine which is founded upon this triple hypothesis: the radical passiveness of mankind, the omnipotence of the law, the infallibility of the legislator. This is the sacred symbol of the party that proclaims itself exclusively democratic. So the mankind is passive, the law is omnipotent, and the legislator is infallible. It is true that it professes also to be social. So far as it is democratic, it has an unlimited faith in mankind. So far as it is social, it places mankind beneath the mud. Are political rights under discussion? Is a legislator to be chosen? Oh, then the people possess science by instinct. They are gifted with an admirable discernment. Their will is always right. The general will cannot err. Suffrage cannot be too universal. Nobody is under any responsibility to society. The will and the capacity to choose well are taken for granted. This sounds like Rousseau again, like when we read The Makers of the Modern Mind, I think. Can the people be mistaken? Are we not living in an age of enlightenment? What? Are the people to be forever led about by the nose? Have they not acquired their rights at the cost of effort and sacrifice? Have they not given sufficient proof of intelligence and wisdom? Are they not arrived at maturity? Are they not in a state to judge for themselves? Do they not know their own interest? Is there a man or a class who would dare to claim the right of putting himself in the place of the people, of deciding and of acting for them? No, no. The people would be free, and they shall be so. They wish to conduct their own affairs, and they shall do so. But when once the legislator is duly elected, then indeed the style of his speech alters. So, okay, that was him giving a speech saying, you guys are definitely going to get it right. And I'm going to, you guys deserve it. You're going to get everything you want. And then he's saying, but when once the legislator is duly elected, then indeed the style of his speech alters. This is funny because it happens. I can't imagine an end to this cycle if it's been going on for hundreds of years. The nation is sent back into passiveness, inertness, nothingness, and the legislator takes possession of omnipotence. It is for him to invent, for him to direct, for him to impel, for him to organize. Mankind has nothing to do but to submit. The hour of despotism has struck, and we must observe that this is decisive. For the people, just before so enlightened, so moral, so perfect, have no inclinations at all, or if they have any, these all lead them downwards towards degradation. And yet they ought to have a little liberty. But are we not assured by Mr. Considerant that liberty leads fatally to monopoly? That is such a great fallacy to point out. Are we not told that liberty is competition, and that competition, according to Mr. Louis Blanc, is a system of extermination for the people and of ruination for trade? It's the great leveler, by the way. We'll discuss that another time. For that reason, people are exterminated and ruined in proportion as they are free. Take, for example, Switzerland, Holland, England, and the United States. Does not Mr. Louis Blanc tell us again that competition leads to monopoly, and that for the same reason, cheapness leads to exorbitant prices? That competition tends to drain the sources of consumption and diverts production to a destructive activity? That competition forces production to increase and consumption to decrease? Whence it follows that free people produce for the sake of not consuming, that there is nothing but oppression and madness among them, and that it is absolutely necessary for Louis Blanc to see to it. What sort of liberty should be allowed to men? Liberty of conscience? But we should see them all profiting by their permission to become atheists. Liberty of education? But parents would be paying professors to teach their sons immorality and error. Besides, if we are to believe Mr. Thiers, Thiers, education, if left to the national liberty, would cease to be national, and we should be educating our children in the ideas of the Turks or the Hindus, instead of which, thanks to the legal despotism of the universities, they have the good fortune to be educated in the noble ideas of the Romans. Liberty of labor? But this is only competition, whose effect is to leave all products unconsumed, to exterminate the people, and to ruin the tradesmen. The liberty of exchange? But it is well known that the protectionists have shown over and over again that a man will inevitably be ruined when he exchanges freely, and that to become rich, it is necessary to exchange without liberty. Liberty of association? But according to the socialist doctrine, liberty and association exclude each other. For the liberty of men is attacked just to force them to associate. The thing about Bastiat is he's like using a lot of irony and like sarcasm, and it's can be a little confusing. Okay, you must see then that the socialist democrats cannot in conscience allow men any liberty, because by their own nature they tend in every instance to all kinds of degradation and demoralization. Right. And here's the thing, which my dad and I used to always talk about. If they think man is so depraved and irrational and unaltruistic, why would the collection of men, society itself, or politicians be better? And how would those depraved people know to vote for the good ones? I mean, it just makes it's inherently impossible. Okay, we are therefore left to conjecture in this case upon what foundation universal suffrage is claimed for them with so much importunity. Yeah. The pretensions of organizers suggest another question, which I have often asked them, and to which I am not aware that I ever received an answer. Since the natural tendencies of mankind are so bad that it is not safe to allow them liberty, how comes it to pass that the tendencies of organizers are always good? Do not the legislators and their agents form a part of the human race? Do they consider that they are composed of different materials from the rest of mankind? They say that society, exactly. They say that society, when left to itself, rushes to inevitable destruction because its instincts are perverse. They presume to stop it in its downward course and to give it a better direction. They have therefore received from heaven intelligence and virtues that place them beyond and above mankind. Let them show their title to this superiority. They would be our shepherds, and we are to be their flock. This arrangement presupposes in them a natural superiority, the right to which we are fully justified in calling upon them to prove. You must observe that I am not contending against their right to invent social combinations, to propagate them, to recommend them, and to try them upon themselves or at their own expense and risk. But I do dispute their right to impose them upon us through the medium of the law, that is, by force and by public taxes. I would not insist upon the Capetists, the Fourierists, the Proudhonians, and the academics and the protectionists renouncing their own particular ideas. I would only have them renounce the idea that is common to them all, viz., that at subjecting us by force to their own categories and rankings, to their social laboratories, to their ever-inflating bank, to their Greco-Roman morality, and to their commercial restrictions, I would ask them to allow us the faculty of judging of their plans and not to oblige us to adopt them if we find that they hurt our interests or are repugnant to our consciences. To presume to have recourse to power and taxation, besides being oppressive and unjust, implies further the pernicious assumption that the organized is infallible and mankind incompetent. And if mankind is not competent to judge for itself, why do they talk so much about universal suffrage? This contradiction in ideas is unhappily to be found also in facts, and whilst the French nation has preceded all others in obtaining its rights, or rather its political claims, this has by no means prevented it from being more governed and directed and imposed upon and fettered and cheated than any other nation. I always thought that about the US versus the UK and Germany or whatever. It's like, why is our tax rate as high as theirs if we have all this liberty and productivity and freedom and all that? Like, it seems like the exact same social democracy. It is also the one of all others where revolutions are constantly to be dreaded, and it is perfectly natural that it should be so. So long as this idea is retained, which is admitted by all our politicians and so energetically expressed by Mr. Louis Blanc in these words, quote, society receives its impulse from power, end quote. So long as men consider themselves as capable of feeling yet passive, incapable of raising themselves by their own discernment and by their own energy to any morality or well-being, and while they expect everything from the law, in a word, while they admit that their relations with the state are the same as those of the flock with the shepherd, it is clear that the responsibility of power is immense. Fortune and misfortune, wealth and destitution, equality and inequality all proceed from it. It is charged with everything. It undertakes everything. It does everything. Therefore, it has to answer for everything. If we are happy, it has a right to claim our gratitude. But if we are miserable, it alone must bear the blame. Are not our persons and property, in fact, at its disposal? Is not the law omnipotent? In creating the educational monopoly, it has undertaken to answer the expectations of fathers of families who have been deprived of liberty. And if these expectations are disappointed, whose fault is it? This is something that I also say. Let's say LBJ established the welfare state. It's been going on for 60 years. Okay? It didn't work, right? We have homeless, we have poverty. It did not work. So more of it's not going to work better. Socialism harder. Okay, in regulating industry, it has undertaken to make it prosper. Otherwise, it would have been absurd to deprive it of its liberty. And if it suffers, whose fault is it? In pretending to adjust the balance of commerce by the game of tariffs, it undertakes to make commerce prosper. And if, so far from prospering, it is destroyed, whose fault is it? In granting its protection to maritime armaments in exchange for their liberty, it has undertaken to render them self-sufficient. If they become burdensome, whose fault is it? Thus, there is not a grievance in the nation for which the government does not voluntarily make itself responsible. That's a good point. So constantly blaming the government is because they take responsibility for everything. Is it any wonder that every failure threatens to cause a revolution? And what is the remedy proposed? To extend indefinitely the dominion of the law, the responsibility of government. But if the government undertakes to raise and to regulate wages and is not able to do it, if it undertakes to assist all those who are in want and is not able to do it, if it undertakes to provide work for every laborer and is not able to do it, if it undertakes to offer to all who wish to borrow easy credit and is not able to do it, if, in words that we regret, should have escaped the pen of Mr. de Lamartine, quote, the state considers that its mission is to enlighten, to develop, to enlarge, to strengthen, to spiritualize, and to sanctify the soul of the people. If it fails in this, is it not obvious that after every disappointment, which, alas, is more than probable, there will be a no less inevitable revolution? I shall now resume the subject by remarking that immediately after the economical part of the question and before the political part, a leading question presents itself. It is the following: what is law? What ought it to be? What is its domain? What are its limits? Where, in fact, does the prerogative of the legislator stop? I have no hesitation in answering. Law is common force organized to prevent injustice. In short, law is justice. I just want to interject. This is the power of hijacking language. I always say that my tagline for my shows was always truth, liberty, and justice. But I don't want people to think I mean social justice, and they've hijacked justice to be ambiguous, to mean injustice. Do the right thing. Watch the movie Do the Right Thing if you want to see that in action. Okay. It is not true that the legislator has absolute power over our persons and property, since they pre-exist, and his work is only to secure them from injury. It is not true that the mission of the law is to regulate our consciences, our ideas, our will, our education, our sentiments, our works, our exchanges, our gifts, our enjoyments. Its mission is to prevent the rights of one from interfering with those of another in any one of those things. Law, because it has force for its necessary sanction, can only have the domain of force, which is justice. Let's reread that one. Law, because it has force for its necessary sanction, can only have the domain of force, which is justice. Okay, you can only use force. It's the NAP. I mean, I guess, well, the non-aggression principle, but you can only use force in self-defense. And that's where the law must begin and end, is what he's saying. Okay, and as every individual has a right to have recourse to force only in cases of lawful defense, so collective force, which is only the union of individual forces, cannot be rationally used for any other end. That's what I always say. That's what I always say. If you personally do not have the right to take action, you cannot have the government take action. And actually, the abortion question is tricky in that way, because would you as an individual have the right? A woman wants to have an abortion, so she stops eating and drinking, let's say, right? But it's illegal to kill that baby. Do you personally have the right to tie that woman up in your house and force feed her with a tube and give her an IV full of fluids? I mean, do you personally have that right? And that's a tricky thing. So I always say, if you do not have the right personally to do something, the law cannot possibly have the right. That's why the government can't have rocket launchers and I know that sounds bad, but there wouldn't be any, because they wouldn't have rockets, because we would live in a just world and they wouldn't want to pop off at people 5,000 miles away who couldn't possibly pose a threat to us. Anyway, the law then is solely the organization of individual rights that existed before law. Law is justice. So far from being able to oppress the people or to plunder their property, even for a philanthropic end, its mission is to protect the people and to secure to them the possession of their property. It must not be said either that it may be philanthropic, so long as it abstains from all oppression, for this is a contradiction. The law cannot avoid acting upon our persons and property. If it does not secure them, then it violates them if it touches them. This is what I would say. You can't be a left-leaning libertarian. Like, you cannot. People will not have the right to smoke pot if you have the obligation to provide their health care. or whatever, if you think pot's good for you, but they want people aren't going to have the rights to harm themselves or to do something that you think is harmful. You know what I'm saying? You got the message. Okay. The law is justice. Nothing can be more clear and simple, more perfectly defined and bounded, or more visible to every eye. For justice is a given quantity, immutable and unchangeable, and which admits of neither increase or diminution. Depart from this point. Make the law religious, fraternal, equalizing, industrial, literary, or artistic, and you will be lost in vagueness and uncertainty. You will be upon unknown ground in a forced utopia. Unknown ground. That's the thing. The natural order of this, don't touch me or my stuff, and on the margin, like, is this water my stuff? Like, or is it not? That's the purview of law. If you don't agree with what the law came up with, it uses force. That's it. And if you go to these other things, you will be upon unknown ground in a forced utopia, or what is worse, in the midst of a multitude of contending utopias, each striving to gain possession of the law and to oppose it upon you. And that's what we have now, the left and the right. It's just tyranny from both sides. That's the argument. For fraternity and philanthropy have no fixed limits as justice has. Where will you stop? Where is the law to stop? One person, Mr. de Saint Cric, will only extend his philanthropy to some of the industrial classes and will require the law to slight the consumers in favor of the producers. Another, like Mr. Considerant, will take up the cause of the working classes and claim for them by means of the law at a fixed rate, clothing, lodging, food, and everything necessary for the support of life. A third, Mr. Louis Blanc, will say, and with reason, that this would be an incomplete fraternity and that the law ought to provide them with tools of labor and education. A fourth will observe that such an arrangement still leaves room for inequality and that the law ought to introduce into the most remote hamlets luxury, literature, and the arts. Rural internet. The rural people need the internet. This is the high road to communism. In other words, legislation will be, as it is now, the battlefield for everybody's dreams and everybody's covetousness. Law is justice. In this proposition, we represent to ourselves a simple, immovable government. And I defy anyone to tell me whence the thought of a revolution, an insurrection, or a simple disturbance could arise against a public force confined to the repression of injustice. Under such a system, there would be more well-being, and this well-being would be more equally distributed. That is totally true. And as to the sufferings inseparable from humanity, no one would think of accusing the government of them, for it would be as innocent of them as it is of the variations of the temperature. How things have changed. Have the people ever been known to rise against the Court of Appeals or assail the justices of the peace for the sake of claiming the rate of wages, free credit, tools of labor, the advantages of the tariff, or the social workshop? I mean, now, because they've been indoctrinated with the idea that these things are rights. They know perfectly well that these matters are beyond the jurisdiction of the justices of the peace, and they would soon learn that they are not within the jurisdiction of the law quite as much. But if the law were to be made upon the principle of fraternity, if it were to be proclaimed that from it proceed all benefits and all evils, that it is responsible for every individual grievance and for every social inequality, then you open the door to an endless succession of complaints, irritations, troubles, and revolutions. Yes, that is what happened. He's prescient. Law is justice. And it would be very strange if it could properly be anything else. Is not justice right? Are not rights equal? With what show of right can the law interfere to subject me to the social plans of Messieurs Mimeret, de Melun, Thiers, or Louis Blanc, rather than to subject these gentlemen to my plans? Is it to be supposed that nature has not bestowed upon me sufficient imagination to invent a utopia too? Is it for the law to make choice of one amongst so many fancies and to make use of the public force in its service? Law is justice. And let it not be said, as it continually is, that the law in this sense would be atheistic, individual, and heartless, and that it would mold mankind in its own image. This is an absurd conclusion, quite worthy of the governmental infatuation which sees mankind in the law. What then? Does it follow that if we are free, we shall cease to act? Does it follow that if we do not receive an impulse from the law, we shall receive no impulse at all? Does it follow that if the law confines itself to securing to us the free exercise of our faculties would be paralyzed? Does it follow that if the law does not impose upon us forms of religion, modes of association, methods of education, rules for labor, directions for exchange, and plans for charity, we shall plunge headlong into atheism, isolation, ignorance, misery, and greed? Does it follow that we shall no longer recognize the power and goodness of God, that we shall cease to associate together, to help each other, to love and assist our unfortunate brethren, to study the secrets of nature, and to aspire after perfection in our existence? Law is justice. And it is under the law of justice, under the reign of right, under the influence of liberty, security, stability, and responsibility, that every man will attain to the fullness of his worth, to all the dignity of his being, and that mankind will accomplish with order and with calmness, slowly, it is true, but with certainty, the progress ordained for it. I believe that my theory is correct. For whatever be the question upon which I am arguing, whether it be religious, philosophical, political, or economical, whether it affects well-being, morality, equality, right, justice, progress, responsibility, property, labor, exchange, capital, wages, taxes, population, credit, or government, at whatever point of the scientific horizon I start from, I invariably come to the same thing. The solution of the social problem is in liberty. This reminds me of Ron Paul's farewell address to Congress. It's very nice. You should read it. We should listen to it together someday. And have I not experienced on my side? Cast your eye over the globe. Which are the happy? See, this is what I was wondering actually when he's saying, wouldn't we do all these things? I'm thinking, well, two things have happened since then. One, people have been just so dumbed down, so inured to this welfare state that they might be. I mean, I think it would take a very short amount of time, 3 missed meals or whatever, for people to like wake up out of that fog. But we have now we have so many different cultural foundations, the subcultures in all of our countries, that I really don't know, if every country is individualistic like that. If every country is, they're not. People are not raised with these fundamental civic understandings, like the liberal arts. I don't think so. I could be wrong, but I think it's pretty obvious that that is true. So it would be pretty simple to just, if people were raised to it. That's why I always said, like, I don't even care about immigration. Just let's see how the politics of immigration change. If you said that's totally no problem, the only thing is that no one can vote who wasn't born here, who wasn't born and raised with the Constitution as a backdrop. Are you really coming here because you're dying to vote? Or are you coming here because you want a job? And then see how many protests there are, how many politicians are, crying for the plight of immigrants. So anyway, but yes, what I do believe that what he's talking about is universal to mankind. But some of these, we're reading this right now because these concepts do need to be elucidated, do need to be spoken, to be understood, to be recognized. And it helps if you're raised on it. And have I not experienced on my side? Cast your eye over the globe. Which are the happiest, the most moral, and the most peaceable nations? Those where the law interferes the least with private activity, where the government is the least felt, where individuality has the most scope and public opinion the most influence, where the machinery of the administration is the least important and the least complicated, where taxation is lightest and least equal, popular discontent the least excited and the least justifiable, where the responsibility of individuals and classes is the most active, and where, consequently, if morals are not in a perfect state, at any rate, they tend incessantly to correct themselves, where transactions, meetings, and associations are the least fettered. I just have to say one more thing. My son was in Latvia on a school thing, and I was talking to somebody or listening to an interview or something from someone from an African country. When I heard the African country, the chick was saying it's so hard to start a business, and that's why I want to come to America and have opportunity. So my son told me like how crappy the economy was, and the people just didn't have a lot of stuff or whatever. And um, I said, I bet it's hard to start a business. And he had actually heard that already. He said, yeah, that's what they say. It's just too hard to start a business. So yes, what this stuff is, when transactions are least fettered, is I think might be the bottom of it all. Where labor, capital, and production suffer the least from artificial displacements. Yes, like a hypercharging AI, artificial. Okay, where mankind follows most completely its own natural course, where the thought of God prevails the most over the inventions of men, those in short who realize the most nearly this idea that within the limits of right, all should flow from the free, perfectible, and voluntary action of man. Nothing be attempted by the law or by force except the administration of universal justice. I cannot avoid coming to this conclusion that there are too many great men in the world. There are too many legislators, organizers, institutors of society, conductors of the people, fathers of nations, et cetera, et cetera. Too many persons place themselves above mankind to rule and patronize it. Too many persons make a trade, patronize it. Too many persons make a trade of looking after it. It will be answered. Quote, you yourself are occupied upon it all this time. Very true. He's saying, what about you, Bastiat? But it must be admitted that it is in another sense entirely that I am speaking. And if I join the reformers, it is solely for the purpose of inducing them to relax their hold. I am not doing as Vaucanson did with his automaton, but as a physiologist does with the human frame. I would study and admire it. I am acting with regard to it in the spirit that animated a celebrated traveler. He found himself in the midst of a savage tribe. A child had just been born, and a crowd of soothsayers, magicians, and quacks were around it, armed with rings, hooks, and bandages. One said, this child will never smell the perfume of a calumet unless I stretch his nostrils. Another said, he will be without the sense of hearing unless I draw his ears down to his shoulders. A third said, he will never see the light of the sun unless I give his eyes an oblique direction. A fourth said, he will never be upright unless I bend his legs. A fifth said, he will not be able to think unless I press his brain. Stop, said the traveler. Whatever God does is well done. Do not pretend to know more than he. And as he has given organs to this frail creature, allow those organs to develop themselves, to strengthen themselves by exercise, use, experience, and liberty. God has implanted in mankind also all that is necessary to enable it to accomplish its destinies. There is a providential social physiology, as well as a providential human physiology. The social organs are constituted so as to enable them to develop harmoniously in the grand air of liberty. Away then with quacks and organizers. Away with their rings and their chains and their hooks and their pincers. Away with their artificial methods. Away with their social laboratories, their governmental whims, their centralization, their tariffs, their universities, their state religions, their inflationary or monopolizing banks, their limitations, their restrictions, their moralizations, and their equalization by taxation. And now, after having vainly afflicted upon the social body so many systems, let them end where they ought to have begun. Reject all systems and try liberty. Liberty, which is an act of faith in God and his work. Not too shabby. Not too shabby. So I thank you all for coming. I couldn't read the chats as I went because this time I'm reading this off a PDF, which I think is so much nicer because then I can use my hands and look at the screen, which gives a little more eye contact there. Anyway, but I do enjoy your company. I appreciate that you're coming, and I do hope that you'll come. I wasn't going to do it live, but you know what? I'll do it live so that you guys can pitch in with questions. Let me double check. I'm speaking to Jonathan Newman next Tuesday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. So that'll be super fun. Thank you all. And I will see you then.